that come to mind. Because we tend to think of, like I said, the gametes, which are going to be egg and sperm, right? Ovaries produce an egg. The testes produce the sperm. So let's think about our body as a whole, okay? Our body as a whole, all right? Where up here we've got a little gland called the pituitary gland. That, and then attached to it is going to be something called the hypothalamus. You guys will be learning about this. But in order for either the ovaries or the testes to do their job, they need a chemical signal. A chemical signal. Does everybody see that in the picture? Okay? I.e., a hormone. A big one that can affect ovaries and testes. We have our luteinizing hormone. We have a follicle stimulating hormone. We have several that get released. And they will go and act on the ovaries or the testes. So if we think about the cells, for example, of an ovary, okay? Let's think about the cells of an ovary. We've got all of those, if we're looking at the ovary, okay? We've got all these cells that are in there, okay? And and females, for the most part, have two. One will put out an egg 1 month, every 28 days. The other one will put out an egg. So they switch off, okay? In order to do that, these cells have to develop so that as we get to one, that we can have the developing egg, okay? They need that chemical signal. So from the pituitary, we will get, for example, follicle stimulating, and it will make its way to the cell membrane where we have a little receptor protein, and the only way for this to work would be for that chemical, let's use FSH, to attach. Is everybody following me? Now, it doesn't move directly across the membrane. What it does is it affects these three. Okay, is everybody with me? So now I've got three little proteins, and that can go and now affect the actual nucleus of that cell. One of those three can do that and help an egg develop.
So can that process kind of be thought of like activation energy?
Yeah, sort of, yes. Because we are going to see this protein carrying out a reaction. Now, proteins that are going to help a chemical reaction take place help provide that activation energy. So, sometimes they just simply need to get the chemical signal. The chemical signal begins to create a series of reactions within that cell. Now this one we mentioned on Wednesday of last week. Because this was the one where I showed it having a gate, a molecule had to attach to it. When it did, the gate opened, sodium rushes in, and that would begin to affect another gated protein, being my voltage gated. So we already discussed that ligand gated. If the ligand, for example, acetylcholine, we talked about that. Did we talk about that Wednesday? What got released to make the muscle contract? That's the neurotransmitter. Did we do that, Cecilia? Did we cover that? Don't remember. Okay, so if we think back to what I talked about on Wednesday, now remember, some of the cells of our body are electric. All right? And do we happen to know how we know that some of the cells of our body are electrical? Did we talk about that? No? Okay. The reason that I know that some of the cells of my body are electrical is because I can test it. For example, nerve cells. I know that nerve cells are electrical because a way that I can test, for example, the electricity in my brain is to get an EEG, an electrical encephalogram. I can do a myogram, which means I can test the activity of my skeletal muscle because they can stick little electrodes on me and test it. Okay? So the reason that those cells are electrical is because of the pluses and the minuses. Okay? Which is why, now if you guys remember, I kind of drew a little nerve cell and it was hitting a skeletal muscle cell. I had an area, does everybody remember this now? And I had an area of the synapse, and this ending from a nerve cell can release its product. The only product a cell can make is protein. In the case for skeletal muscle to move, it releases acetylcholine. That's the product of the nerve cell. And do you guys remember how I showed that only in this area did we find a whole bunch of our ligand gated? That was the only place I found ligand gated? Does everybody remember that? Okay, so I only find ligand gated in the area where the nerve met the muscle. But for the rest of my muscle cell, what type did we find? Voltage gated. Because one of the things I tried to point out, inside the cell was mostly negative. When acetylcholine got released, it opened ligand gated. Ligand gated allowed sodium to come in. Does everybody remember that? So if it's mostly negative, but now I've got positive coming in, what did that do to my charge inside the cell? Turned it positive. So now if I'm changing, and this is called my membrane potential, which is something you have on one of the handouts, okay? If this was changing my membrane potential at this area. The other gated channels, because this would be my voltage, pluses, minuses. Everybody familiar with the car battery? Okay, pluses, minuses. Okay, voltage, there's 16 volts. Okay, so that made this change, which made voltage gated change, and their gates open. And if their gates open, what got to rush in? Sodium. So now I get more pluses, which will make another voltage gate open, which allows more sodiums, until I finally get to the point that this needs to stop and the cell needs to go back to its norm. Okay? Its resting potential. And how did we do that? Which type of pump was present? Whitney? My sodium, potassium, which is also, does anybody, we just talked about it. What type of pump? Something powered. ATP powered. And the sodium potassium pump would work, push the sodiums back out, inside of that membrane goes back to negative, and that skeletal muscle can now relax from the contraction. And this is how our skeletal muscles move, which we'll get more in detail with later chapters. But those, okay, those were two types of proteins that can exist in that plasma membrane. So we can have them function as gates. One was a ligand gate, one was a voltage gate. To give you an idea of how important these are, have you ever heard of cystic fibrosis? Okay? What is it? It's a genetic defect.
The lungs produce mucus.
Well, usually a lot of times that people associate it with the lungs is because of the overproduction of the mucus. And it causes people to have a lot of breathing problems. But it's also digestive because we have cells that produce mucus for the digestive system. And the reason that they tend to be very sick is because of that overproduction in the digestive system. They don't get to absorb nutrients. So that's another reason they stay pretty sick. It's a disease that works at that level. It works at the level of these proteins in the plasma membrane. Used to be that people who had it very seldom made it into their teenage years. We are now seeing people live, because of genetic therapy and other treatments for it, we're now seeing people live to actually be able to reproduce. They're living into their 50s. Okay? So they've made a huge improvement in this, but that's the level where things mess up. Right here at this level of the cell.
I was going to say, like, you said it's moving like it's like it's moving fast. It's like, it was, I don't know how to say it.
The inflow of the sodium,
Yeah.
well now it does move quickly. So if we think about this movement of this ion, the opening of these gates, the movement of these materials, think about how quick your muscles move. It's not a slow process. It's milliseconds that things are occurring. So the reason that I'm emphasizing this so much is because of the clinical significance. When somebody comes in sick and they do blood work, one of the things they're checking, sodium and potassium levels. Another level they check, calcium. We just haven't talked about it yet.